Chief Standing Bear rode through the morning mist across the Great Plains, his horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard earth. The year was 1876, and tensions between the Lakota people and white settlers had reached a breaking point. Wars raged across the territory, leaving both sides bitter and filled with hatred. Standing Bear was known throughout his tribe as a fierce warrior who had never shown mercy to enemies. His face bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes held the cold fire of someone who had seen too much violence. The other warriors respected him not just for his courage, but for his unwavering dedication to protecting their way of life. On this particular morning, Standing Bear was leading a small group of warriors back from a successful raid on a settler wagon train. They had recovered stolen horses and supplies that rightfully belonged to their people. The raid had been swift and decisive, just as Standing Bear preferred. He believed that showing strength was the only language the white settlers understood. As they crested a small hill, one of his warriors, a young man named Swift Arrow, called out from ahead.
He had discovered something hidden among a cluster of cottonwood trees near a small creek.
Standing Bear spurred his horse forward, expecting to find abandoned supplies or perhaps wounded enemies trying to escape. What he found instead would challenge everything he believed about war, enemies, and what it meant to be human. Among the trees, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, sat a young white woman. She was no more than 20 years old, with golden hair that caught the morning light. Her dress was torn and dirty, suggesting she had been traveling for days. But it was not the woman herself that stopped Standing Bear in his tracks. It was what she was doing. Cradled in her arms was a small baby, no more than a few months old. The infant was crying softly, and the woman was gently nursing the child, speaking to it in hushed, loving tones that needed no translation. The warriors behind Standing Bear grew silent. They had expected to find treasure or weapons, not this scene of pure maternal love. Some of them shifted uncomfortably on their horses, unsure of what their chief would do. According to the customs of war, captives were either taken back to the village or dealt with immediately. There was no room for sentiment in these harsh times. Standing Bear dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The young woman looked up at him with eyes filled with terror, but she did not stop nursing her child. Instead, she held the baby closer, as if her love alone could protect them both from whatever fate awaited them. For a long moment, chief and captive stared at each other across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Here was everything Standing Bear had been taught to hate about the white settlers. They had taken his people's land, killed their buffalo, and tried to destroy their sacred ways. This woman represented all of that pain and anger. Yet as he watched her gentle care for her child, something unexpected stirred in Standing Bear's chest. He thought of his own mother, who had died when he was just a boy. He remembered how she used to hold him when he was frightened, how her voice could calm any storm in his young heart. He thought of his sister, who had lost her own baby to disease just 2 winters ago, and how she still grieved for that lost child. The baby in the woman's arms was innocent of all the crimes committed by her people. This tiny life had never stolen land or broken treaties. The child knew only hunger, comfort, and the safety of a mother's embrace. In that moment, Standing Bear saw not an enemy, but simply a mother protecting her young, just as any Lakota mother would do. His warriors waited in tense silence, knowing that whatever their chief decided would set the tone for how this encounter would end. Some expected him to take the woman and child as prisoners. Others thought he might show the mercy that was sometimes given to women and children, allowing them to go free but taking their supplies. None of them expected what would happen next. Standing Bear's reaction would not only surprise his own warriors, but would become a story told around Lakota fires for generations to come. It would challenge the very foundations of how enemies were supposed to be treated during times of war, and it would reveal a side of their fierce chief that few had ever seen before. Standing Bear slowly approached the young woman, each step measured and careful. His hand rested on the handle of his knife, but not in threat. It was simply habit, the automatic response of a warrior who had survived countless battles. The woman watched him with wide blue eyes, her breathing quick and shallow with fear. When he was close enough to see the tears streaming down her face, Standing Bear stopped. He could see that she was trying desperately not to cry out, not wanting to frighten her baby. The infant had finished nursing and was now sleeping peacefully against her chest, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Behind him, his warriors grew restless. Swift Arrow cleared his throat softly, a reminder that they needed to make a decision quickly. Other war parties might be in the area, and staying in one place too long was dangerous. But Standing Bear seemed frozen, staring at the woman and child as if seeing something that others could not. The young mother finally found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. Her words were in English, which Standing Bear understood better than most of his warriors. Years of dealing with traders and Indian agents had forced him to learn the white man's language, though he rarely admitted this skill to outsiders. She told him her name was Sarah Mitchell, and that she was traveling with her husband and baby to join her brother's family in Oregon Territory. 3 days ago, her wagon had been attacked by a different war party. Her husband had been killed defending them, and she had managed to escape into the forest with only her baby and the clothes on her back. As Sarah spoke, Standing Bear noticed details that his warriors had missed. Her hands were cut and bleeding from climbing through thorny bushes. Her feet were bare and swollen, her shoes lost somewhere during her desperate flight. Most telling of all, she was clearly weak from hunger and exhaustion. Yet she continued to care for her child without complaint. Standing Bear found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother used to tell him about the old days, before the white settlers came in great numbers. She had spoken of times when different tribes would sometimes show mercy to mothers with young children, recognizing that the bond between mother and child was sacred across all peoples. His grandmother had been a wise woman, respected throughout the tribe for her knowledge of healing and her ability to see into people's hearts. She had always taught him that true strength sometimes meant choosing compassion over revenge. At the time, young Standing Bear had thought these were just stories meant to teach children. Now, facing this terrified mother, he wondered if his grandmother had been preparing him for moments like this. The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, making small sounds that meant hunger was returning. Standing Bear watched as she automatically adjusted her hold, rocking gently to keep the child calm. Her movements were instinctive, protective, filled with the kind of love that transcended all boundaries of race and culture. One of his warriors, an older man named Grey Wolf, rode closer and spoke quietly in Lakota. He reminded Standing Bear that taking prisoners would slow them down, and that the woman would likely die anyway if they left her in the wilderness. It would be more merciful, Grey Wolf suggested, to end her suffering quickly. But Standing Bear shook his head. Something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of harming this mother and child. He thought of his own people's children, how precious each new life was to the tribe. The Lakota had always honored mothers and protected the young. How could he abandon those values now, even when facing an enemy? Sarah must have sensed the discussion taking place around her, because she began to speak again, her voice stronger now despite her fear. She said she was not asking for her own life, but pleaded for mercy for her innocent baby. She offered to serve the tribe, to work for them if they would only let her child live. Her words struck Standing Bear like a physical blow. Here was a woman who was willing to sacrifice her own freedom, perhaps her own life, for the sake of her child. It was exactly what any Lakota mother would do in the same situation. The courage she showed in the face of certain death reminded him of the bravest warriors he had known. Standing Bear turned to look at his men, seeing confusion and uncertainty in their faces. They had followed him into battle many times, trusting his judgment completely. Now they waited to see what kind of man their chief truly was. Would he follow the path of vengeance that had consumed so many on both sides of this conflict? Or would he choose something different? The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and Standing Bear knew they could not stay much longer in this exposed position. A decision had to be made, and whatever he chose would reveal not just his own character, but the values he wanted his people to embody. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, with a frightened mother and innocent child depending on his mercy. Standing Bear knelt down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with Sarah. The movement surprised everyone, including the young mother herself. Chiefs did not kneel before captives. Warriors did not show such gestures to enemies. Yet here was Standing Bear, one of the most feared war leaders on the plains, lowering himself before a white woman and her baby. When he spoke, it was in careful English, his voice rough but understandable. He asked Sarah about her journey, about where she had come from and where she was trying to go. As she answered, he listened not just to her words but to the pain behind them. She spoke of her husband's gentle nature, how he had always treated everyone with kindness regardless of their background. She described their dreams of starting a new life in Oregon, of raising their son in peace. The baby began to fuss again, and Sarah automatically began the gentle bouncing motion that all mothers know. Standing Bear watched this simple act and was transported back to his own childhood. He remembered his sister doing the same thing with her children, the way all the women in his tribe moved when comforting the young. The gestures were identical across cultures, proof that some things were truly universal. Swift Arrow grew impatient and called out a warning. He had spotted dust on the horizon that might mean other riders approaching. Standing Bear knew they were running out of time. Whatever decision he made had to be made now, before circumstances forced his hand in ways he might regret. Standing Bear reached into his medicine bag and pulled out a small piece of dried meat. It was part of his own rations, saved from their morning meal. Without a word, he offered it to Sarah. She stared at the food for a moment, clearly surprised by this gesture of kindness from someone she had expected to kill her. When she accepted the meat and began to eat it gratefully, Standing Bear felt something shift in his chest. This simple act of sharing food was sacred among his people. It created bonds and obligations that went beyond the immediate moment. By accepting his food, Sarah had unknowingly entered into a relationship with him that demanded protection rather than harm. He stood up and turned to face his warriors. For a moment, he looked at each man individually, reading their faces and judging their readiness to follow wherever he might lead. These were good men, loyal fighters who had proven themselves in countless battles. They deserved an explanation for what he was about to do. Speaking in Lakota, Standing Bear told them that he had received a vision. It was not entirely true, but it was not entirely false either. Something had spoken to his heart while watching Sarah nurse her child, something that felt like guidance from the spirits of his ancestors. He said that harming this mother and child would bring bad medicine to their tribe, and that the spirits demanded a different path. His warriors listened in respectful silence. Among the Lakota, visions and spiritual guidance were never questioned lightly. If their chief claimed to have received direction from the spirit world, they would follow that guidance even if they did not fully understand it. This was how their people had survived for generations, by trusting in wisdom that came from beyond the physical world. Gray Wolf, the eldest of the warriors, nodded slowly. He had known Standing Bear since he was a young boy, had watched him grow from an impulsive youth into a wise leader. If Standing Bear said the spirits had spoken, then Gray Wolf would trust that judgment. One by one, the other warriors gave similar nods of acceptance. Standing Bear turned back to Sarah, who had been watching this exchange with growing hope. He told her in English that she and her baby would not be harmed. More than that, he would personally ensure their safety, but he explained that he could not simply let them go into the wilderness to die of exposure or starvation. The nearest white settlement was many days away, too far for a woman on foot with a baby to reach alive. Sarah's relief was so intense that she began to sob, clutching her baby tighter as waves of emotion overwhelmed her. She had been preparing herself for death, had been trying to be brave for her child's sake. Now, unexpectedly, she was being offered not just life, but protection. It was more kindness than she had dared to hope for. Standing Bear explained that they would take her to his village, where she would be treated as a guest rather than a prisoner. She would be given food, shelter, and medical care. When she was strong enough and when it was safe to travel, arrangements would be made to return her to her own people. Until then, she would be under his personal protection, which meant that no one in the tribe would be allowed to harm her or her child. The decision was made, but Standing Bear knew that the real challenges lay ahead. Taking a white woman and her baby to a Lakota village during wartime was unprecedented. His people had suffered greatly at the hands of white soldiers and settlers. Many had lost family members, friends, and sacred lands. Asking them to show hospitality to representatives of their enemies would test the very foundations of their traditional values. But Standing Bear had made his choice, guided by something deeper than politics or warfare. He had seen the sacred bond between mother and child, and had recognized it as something that transcended all human divisions. Now he had to convince his entire tribe to see what he had seen, to choose compassion over vengeance in a time when such choices seemed impossible. The journey to the Lakota village took 2 days. and it was unlike any march Standing Bear had ever led. Sarah rode behind Swift Arrow on his horse, holding her baby carefully as they traveled across the rolling prairie. The warriors took turns sharing their water and food with her, though many did so with obvious reluctance. They were following their chief's orders, but their faces showed the internal struggle between duty and their feelings about helping an enemy. During the first night, as they camped beside a small stream, Standing Bear watched Sarah care for her baby by firelight. She had fashioned a makeshift diaper from strips torn from her petticoat, and she sang soft lullabies to keep the infant calm. Her voice was sweet and pure, carrying across the quiet camp and touching something deep in the hearts of even the most hardened warriors. Grey Wolf approached Standing Bear as he stood guard at the edge of their camp. The older warrior spoke quietly, expressing his concerns about what would happen when they reached the village. Many of their people had recently lost loved ones to white soldiers. Families were grieving, emotions were raw, and anger burned bright in too many hearts. Bringing Sarah and her baby into such an environment might spark violence that even Standing Bear could not control. Standing Bear listened to these concerns without anger. Grey Wolf was speaking from wisdom and experience, and his warnings were well-founded. The chief knew that his decision to protect Sarah would face serious challenges once they reached home. Some tribal members might see his actions as weakness or betrayal. Others might question his judgment as a leader, wondering if he had been somehow bewitched by the white woman. But Standing Bear also knew that this moment was a test of who they were as a people. The Lakota had always prided themselves on their honor, their protection of the innocent, and their respect for the sacred bonds of family. If they abandoned those values out of hatred, they would lose something essential about themselves that could never be recovered. On the second morning, Sarah approached Standing Bear with hesitant steps. She had been trying to learn some basic Lakota words from Swift Arrow, wanting to show respect for her protectors. Her pronunciation was clumsy, but her effort was sincere. She thanked Standing Bear in his own language, the words halting but heartfelt. Standing Bear was moved by her attempt to bridge the language barrier. It showed courage and respect that many of his own people would appreciate. He began to teach her other simple phrases, words for please, thank you, and peace. As they rode that day, he told her about Lakota customs and traditions, helping her understand what to expect when they reached the village. He explained that she would be introduced to the tribal council, who would need to approve her presence among them. He warned her that some people might be hostile or suspicious, but that she should remain calm and respectful. Most importantly, he told her about the role of women in Lakota society, how mothers were honored and protected, and how her status as a nursing mother would earn her respect even from those who might otherwise see her as an enemy. As they crested the final hill before their village, Standing Bear felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Below them lay the circle of teepees that represented home, safety, and everything he had spent his life defending. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the spaces between lodges, and the normal rhythm of daily life continued as it had for countless generations. But Standing Bear knew that their arrival would disrupt that peaceful scene. Already scouts had spotted their approach and were riding hard to alert the village. Soon the entire community would know that their war chief was returning with a white woman and her baby. The reaction would be swift and intense. Sarah sensed the tension in her protectors as they approached the village. She held her baby closer, whispering prayers for their safety. She had placed her trust in Standing Bear completely, knowing that her life and her child's life depended entirely on his ability to convince his people to accept them. The first reaction came from a group of young warriors who rode out to meet them. When they saw Sarah, their faces showed shock, anger, and confusion. They spoke rapidly in Lakota, their voices rising with emotion. Standing Bear responded calmly but firmly, his tone making it clear that he would not tolerate any threats against his guests. Word spread quickly through the village, and by the time Standing Bear's party reached the central area, a large crowd had gathered. Women emerged from their teepees, elderly men left their places in the shade, and children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts. The buzz of conversation was loud and urgent, filled with questions and concerns about this unprecedented situation. Standing Bear dismounted first, then helped Sarah down from Swift Arrow's horse. As she stood in the center of the Lakota village holding her baby and surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her, Sarah showed remarkable composure. She kept her eyes respectfully lowered but her back straight, displaying the dignity that would be essential for winning acceptance from these proud people. The tribal council members began to gather, their faces serious and questioning. Standing Bear knew that the real test was about to begin. He would have to explain his actions to the wisest and most respected members of his community, people who had the authority to overrule his decision if they deemed it harmful to the tribe. The next few hours would determine whether his act of mercy would be vindicated or whether it would mark the beginning of his downfall as a leader. The tribal council convened immediately in the large ceremonial teepee at the center of the village. 7 elders took their places in the sacred circle, their weathered faces reflecting decades of wisdom and experience. Standing Bear sat across from them, with Sarah and her baby positioned slightly behind him. The baby had begun to cry softly, sensing the tension in the air, and Sarah gently rocked him while trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Chief among the council members was Elder Spotted Hawk, a man whose opinion carried enormous weight throughout the tribe. He had been Standing Bear's mentor when he was young, teaching him the arts of war and leadership. Now Spotted Hawk's eyes held disappointment and confusion as he looked at his former student. He spoke first, his voice heavy with concern about the precedent being set. Spotted Hawk reminded everyone present of the recent attacks on their people. Just 2 moons ago, white soldiers had burned a peaceful Lakota camp, killing women and children who had been flying flags of truce. 3 families in their own village were still mourning loved ones lost to settler violence. How could they now be asked to show hospitality to representatives of the very people who had caused such pain? Other council members voiced similar concerns. Elder Red Cloud spoke of broken treaties and stolen lands. Elder Iron Bear described the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds that sustained their way of life. Elder Whitefeather told of Lakota children taken from their families and forced into white schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language or practice their sacred traditions. As each elder spoke, the weight of collective grief and anger filled the teepee. Standing Bear listened respectfully to every word, understanding that their pain was real and justified. These were not cruel men seeking revenge, but leaders trying to protect their people from further harm. Their concerns about his decision were legitimate and deserved serious consideration. When it was his turn to speak, Standing Bear rose slowly and addressed the council with all the respect and formality that the situation demanded. He acknowledged the validity of their concerns and expressed his own grief for the losses their people had suffered. He did not try to minimize the pain or pretend that the conflicts between their peoples were not real and serious. But then Standing Bear told them about the moment when he had first seen Sarah nursing her baby. He described how the scene had reminded him of his own mother, his sister, and all the Lakota women who had ever cared for their young. He spoke of the sacred nature of the bond between mother and child, and how that bond transcended all divisions of race, culture, and politics. Standing Bear reminded the council of their own traditions and values. The Lakota had always honored courage, and this young woman had shown extraordinary bravery in her efforts to protect her child. They had always respected the bond between parent and child, regardless of species or tribe. Many of their most sacred stories told of animals adopting orphaned young from other species, showing that nature herself recognized the universal importance of protecting the innocent. He told them about his grandmother's teachings, how she had always said that true strength sometimes required choosing the harder path of compassion over the easier path of revenge. Standing Bear explained that killing or harming Sarah and her baby would accomplish nothing positive for their people. It would not bring back their lost loved ones, would not restore their stolen lands, and would not heal their wounded hearts. Instead, Standing Bear argued, showing mercy in this situation would demonstrate the moral superiority of Lakota values over the hatred and violence that had consumed so much of both sides in this conflict. It would prove that they were still capable of rising above the cycle of vengeance that threatened to destroy everything noble about their way of life. Elder Spotted Hawk listened carefully to Standing Bear's words, then asked to examine the white woman and her child more closely. Sarah was brought forward still holding her baby, who had finally fallen asleep despite the intense discussion surrounding them. Spotted Hawk studied her face, noting the genuine fear but also the dignity with which she carried herself. Through Standing Bear as translator, Spotted Hawk asked Sarah about her family, her journey, and her intentions. Sarah answered honestly, describing her husband's death and her desperate flight through the wilderness. When asked about her feelings toward the Lakota people, she surprised everyone by expressing not hatred, but gratitude for Standing Bear's mercy and protection. Sarah told them that before meeting Standing Bear, she had believed all the terrible stories about savage Indians that were common among white settlers. But his kindness had shown her that these stories were false, that the Lakota were capable of honor and compassion even toward their enemies. She said she now understood that both sides had suffered in this conflict, and that perhaps it was time for someone to choose a different path. Her words, translated by Standing Bear, created a stir among the council members. They had expected defiance, hatred, or at best fearful submission. Instead, they found intelligence, honesty, and a surprising willingness to see their perspective. This was not the type of enemy they had been led to expect from white settlers. Elder White Feather, who had lost his own grandson to white soldiers, studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking. He said that while he could not forget the wrongs done to their people, he could also not ignore the obvious love between this mother and child. The baby was innocent of all crimes, and the woman was clearly devoted to protecting her young just as any Lakota mother would be. The council debate continued for several hours, with arguments flowing back and forth like the currents of a river. Some members remained convinced that harboring enemies was too dangerous, while others began to see Standing Bear's point about maintaining their moral principles even in wartime. The decision would ultimately determine not just the fate of Sarah and her baby, but the very soul of their community. As the sun began to set outside the council teepee, Elder Spotted Hawk called for a formal vote. Each council member would speak their decision and explain their reasoning. The process was sacred among the Lakota, ensuring that all voices were heard and that any decision reached would have the full authority of traditional law. Elder Iron Bear spoke first, his voice heavy with the weight of recent losses. He voted against allowing Sarah to remain in the village, arguing that the risk to their people was too great. Enemy sympathizers might use her presence to spy on their defenses or learn about their plans. Even if she meant no harm personally, her very existence among them could endanger lives. Elder Red Cloud agreed with Iron Bear, but for different reasons. He worried that showing mercy to white captives would be seen as weakness by other tribes and by white military leaders. Such perceived weakness might invite more attacks on their people. Sometimes, he argued, leaders had to make harsh decisions to protect the greater good of their community. Elder Singing Wolf surprised everyone by voting in favor of Standing Bear's decision. He reminded the council that their spiritual traditions taught respect for all mothers and their young. He spoke of how Lakota women had always been the keepers of life and nurturers of the future. To harm a nursing mother would violate everything sacred about their beliefs regarding the feminine power that sustained all existence. Elder White Feather, despite his personal losses, also voted to allow Sarah to remain. He said that his dead grandson would be better, honored by showing the world that Lakota people were capable of rising above hatred than by perpetuating the cycle of violence that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Mercy, he declared, was sometimes the greatest form of strength. The vote stood at 2 in favor, 2 against, with 3 elders yet to speak. Elder Greyhorse, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally rose to address the council. He was the oldest member of the group, a man whose memories stretched back to the early days of contact with white settlers, when peaceful coexistence had still seemed possible. Greyhorse spoke of the prophecies he had learned as a young man, ancient teachings that foretold a time when the Lakota would face a great test of their character. The prophecies suggested that their response to this test would determine whether their people would survive with their souls intact or would be consumed by the same darkness that had infected their enemies. Looking directly at Sarah and her baby, Greyhorse said he believed this moment was part of that prophetic test. The choice they made here would echo through generations, influencing how their children and grandchildren understood what it meant to be Lakota. He voted to allow Sarah to remain, but with strict conditions to ensure the safety of their community. Elder Black Moon was the final council member to speak. She was the only woman on the council, a position she had earned through her wisdom as a healer and her courage in battle when their village had been attacked 5 years earlier. Her opinion carried special weight because she understood better than anyone the sacred nature of the mother-child bond. Black Moon studied Sarah with the keen eye of someone who had delivered countless babies and comforted grieving mothers. She saw the exhaustion, the fear, but also the unbreakable determination to protect her child that marked every true mother. This was not an enemy spy or a threat to their people. This was simply a woman doing what all mothers had done since the beginning of time. Black Moon voted to accept Sarah and her baby, making the final tally 4 in favor and 3 against. According to Lakota law, a majority decision by the council was binding, but such a close vote meant that the community would need careful guidance to accept the ruling peacefully. Elder Spotted Hawk announced the decision and outlined the conditions that would govern Sarah's stay among them. She would be housed in a teepee near the center of the village where she could be protected, but also monitored. Standing Bear would be personally responsible for her behavior and for ensuring that she posed no threat to tribal security. She would be expected to contribute to the community through work appropriate to her skills and physical condition. Most importantly, Sarah would be given the status of a protected guest rather than a prisoner. This meant that any tribal member who harmed her or her child would face severe punishment. At the same time, she would be expected to respect Lakota customs and laws during her stay. When circumstances permitted, arrangements would be made to return her safely to white settlements, but only when such a journey could be undertaken without endangering the tribe. The decision created mixed reactions throughout the village. Some families openly welcomed the ruling, seeing it as proof that their people had not lost their fundamental humanity despite the brutal conflicts surrounding them. These supporters brought gifts of food, clothing, and supplies for the baby, showing the traditional Lakota hospitality toward guests. Others remained skeptical or openly hostile. A group of young warriors led by a hot-headed brave named Charging Bull argued that the council had made a dangerous mistake. They believed that mercy toward enemies would be seen as weakness and would invite further attacks on their people. These dissenting voices represented a significant portion of the community and could not be ignored. Standing Bear knew that his greatest challenge still lay ahead. The council's decision was only the beginning. Now he had to find a way to integrate Sarah and her baby into daily village life while maintaining peace among his own people. One wrong move, one cultural misunderstanding, one moment of carelessness could shatter the fragile acceptance that had been achieved and put everyone at risk. Sarah, exhausted by the long day and overwhelmed by the complex emotions surrounding her situation, finally allowed herself to hope that she and her baby might actually survive this ordeal. But she also understood that her real test was just beginning. She would have to prove herself worthy of the extraordinary mercy she had been shown, and she would have to do it while navigating a culture completely foreign to everything she had ever known. 3 months had passed since Sarah and her baby first arrived in the Lakota village, and the transformation was remarkable. What had begun as a tense experiment in mercy had evolved into something none of them had expected. Sarah had not only adapted to life among the Lakota, but had become a valued member of the community in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The baby, whom Sarah had named Thomas after his father, had thrived under the care and attention of the entire village. Lakota children had gathered around him with curiosity and delight, teaching him games and songs in their own language. The tribal women had taken turns helping Sarah with childcare, sharing their knowledge of herbs and remedies that kept the infant healthy and strong. Sarah herself had proven to be a quick learner and hard worker. She had mastered basic Lakota phrases and customs, showing deep respect for the traditions that governed daily life. Her skills as a seamstress, learned from her mother back in Missouri, had made her popular among the women who appreciated her ability to repair clothes and create beautiful decorations for special occasions. Most significantly, Sarah had begun to serve as an informal bridge between the Lakota and the outside world. Her presence had allowed Standing Bear to gain valuable intelligence about white military movements and political developments. Through careful questioning and Sarah's honest answers, the tribe had learned about changing attitudes among some white settlers who were growing tired of the constant warfare. The success of Standing Bear's decision had not gone unnoticed by other tribal leaders. Delegations from neighboring bands had come to see this unprecedented situation for themselves. Some had been skeptical, expecting to find a dangerous precedent that weakened Lakota resolve. Instead, they found a community that had maintained its strength while demonstrating its moral superiority over those who chose hatred and revenge. Elder Spotted Hawk, who had initially been among the most reluctant to accept Sarah, had become one of her strongest supporters. He often said that watching her devotion to her child had reminded him of what they were fighting to protect. The innocence and joy of children, regardless of their background, represented the future that all parents hoped to secure for their offspring. The story of Standing Bear's mercy had spread far beyond the immediate tribal community. Other Lakota bands had begun to reconsider their own approaches to dealing with white captives and refugees. Some had started adopting similar policies of protection for women and children, recognizing that such actions elevated their moral standing without compromising their military effectiveness. But perhaps the most unexpected development had occurred when a delegation of white peace negotiators arrived at the village in late autumn. Word of Standing Bear's treatment of Sarah had reached sympathetic ears in the territorial government. People who were seeking alternatives to the endless cycle of violence that was destroying both communities. Sarah had played a crucial role in these negotiations, serving as translator and cultural interpreter. Her presence provided proof that peaceful coexistence was possible, that members of both cultures could live together with mutual respect and understanding. The negotiations were delicate and complex, but they represented the first genuine hope for lasting peace that either side had seen in years. Standing Bear watched these developments with a mixture of pride and amazement. His simple act of mercy toward a frightened mother had grown into something far larger than he had ever imagined. It had challenged his own people to live up to their highest ideals, had impressed former enemies with Lakota nobility, and had opened doors to possibilities that had seemed impossible just months before. The personal transformation in Sarah was equally remarkable. The terrified young woman who had been found nursing her baby in the wilderness had grown into a confident bridge between two worlds. She had learned to see beyond the prejudices and misconceptions that had shaped her earlier understanding of Native Americans. More importantly, she had found the strength to advocate for peace and understanding even when it meant challenging the beliefs of her own people. When spring arrived, the time came for Sarah to make a difficult choice. Safe passage back to white settlements had been arranged through the peace negotiations, and she was free to return to her former life. But the decision was not as simple as it had once seemed. The Lakota village had become her home, and the people who had once been her captors had become her family. Little Thomas had taken his first steps in a Lakota teepee, had learned to laugh at the playful antics of Lakota children, and had been cradled by Lakota grandmothers who sang him to sleep with ancient lullabies. Sarah herself had found a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced in her previous life. The choice between two worlds was heart-wrenching. In the end, Sarah decided to stay with the Lakota through the summer, helping to facilitate the ongoing peace negotiations and serving as a living symbol of what cooperation could accomplish. She would eventually return to white society, but not as the same person who had fled into the wilderness months before. She carried with her a new understanding of what different cultures could learn from each other when they chose cooperation over conflict. Standing Bear's decision had indeed left his tribe in utter disbelief, but not for the reasons anyone had expected. What had shocked them was not the mercy itself, but the profound positive changes that mercy had brought to their community. They had discovered that choosing compassion over vengeance had made them stronger, not weaker. They had learned that their enemies were capable of growth and change when treated with dignity and respect. The story became legend among the Lakota people, told around fires for generations as an example of how true leadership sometimes required the courage to choose an unexpected path. Standing Bear had shown that the greatest victories were not always won on battlefields, but in moments when people chose to see the humanity in their enemies and respond with wisdom rather than anger. Years later, when historians would write about the conflicts between Native Americans and white settlers, they would note this incident as one of the rare bright spots in a generally dark period of American history. It demonstrated that even in times of greatest hatred and mistrust, individuals on both sides were capable of rising above their circumstances to choose hope over despair, understanding over ignorance, and love over hate. The legacy of that single moment of mercy would echo through time, inspiring others to seek peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible conflicts, and proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating an enemy as a fellow human being worthy of compassion and respect.